Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be another visit to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and I am here specifically to cover an exhibit that takes up the entire third floor, which is the second floor from the top, called The Final Solution, 1940 to 1945. The Holocaust Memorial Museum is absolutely enormous, and I do not want to rush through or skip over anything, which is why I've been visiting it multiple times over and viewing each exhibit thoroughly here on the channel. The Holocaust Memorial Museum is technically free to enter, but because it is so popular, you still have to get a timed entry ticket online as of summer 2025. There is a processing fee of $1 per ticket to reserve online. I met a really nice docent when I arrived this morning who escorted me straight to the third floor, allowing me to bypass the crowds of people who were just beginning their 10 o'clock a.m. tour on the fourth floor, which we already covered last week in the videos The Nazi Assault 1933 through 1939 and What Did Americans Know? Today we are beginning on the third floor to view The Final Solution 1940 through 1945. The first exhibit on this floor is about Anne Frank, possibly one of the most heartbreaking but well-known individual stories. She was only one of more than 1 million Jewish children in Europe who died during the Holocaust. Born in Germany in 1929, she fled with her family to Amsterdam soon after Adolf Hitler came to power. In May of 1940, German troops invaded the Netherlands. The following year, Anne was forced to leave her school to attend a Jewish one. Soon thereafter, the Frank family began making preparations to go into hiding. In May of 1942, Anne, along with other Jews in the Netherlands, was required to wear the Yellow Star of David. That summer, the deportations of Dutch Jews to German-occupied Poland began. On July 5th, Anne's sister Margot received a summons to report for labor. The following day, the Frank family went into hiding. For more than 2 years, they lived with 4 friends in a secret annex behind her father's company warehouse at 263 Prinsengracht. German and Dutch security police, using information provided by an informant, raided the building and arrested the inhabitants on August 4, 1944. The Franks were sent to the Westerbork transit camp and from there deported to Auschwitz on September 3rd. Less than 2 months later, Anne and Margot were transported to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Anne's mother Edith perished at Auschwitz in January 1945. In March, Anne and Margot died from typhus at Bergen-Belsen just weeks before the British Army liberated the camp. Of the 8 persons who hid in the secret annex, only Anne's father Otto survived. Anne Frank is best remembered for the diary she kept. Discovered in the annex after the family's arrest, it reveals the inner life of a young girl growing up in constant danger of capture and deportation. On July 15, 1944, Anne wrote, "That's the difficulty in these times. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us, only to meet the horrible truth and be shattered. It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death." Through the diary, Anne has become a symbol of lost potential. The fate of the Jews in Western European countries occupied by Germany depended above all on the degree of Nazi control in the country, the number of Jews there, and the actions of the country's civilian government and non-Jews. The anti-Jewish policies that Germany established during the 1930s were carried out in all the occupied countries. The Nazis issued laws to define Jews, restricted their civil rights, confiscated their properties and businesses, and banned them from certain professions. Isolated from non-Jews and, in most countries, marked with the Star of David, Jews were without recourse. Beginning in 1942, tens of thousands of them were deported to transit camps and then on to concentration camps and killing centers established by the Nazis in Eastern Europe. After France surrendered on June 22, 1940, a German military government occupied the north. The south was administered by a collaborationist French government based in the town of Vichy. There were 350,000 Jews in France when the Germans invaded. Deportations began in March of 1942. The French police assisted in carrying them out both in the German-occupied zone and in Vichy, France. By the war's end, about 25% of the Jews in France had perished in concentration and death camps. Before the German invasion, 66,000 Jews lived in Belgium, primarily in Antwerp and Brussels. 90% of them were refugees and immigrants. From the summer of 1942 until mid-1944, 25,500 Jews were transported to Auschwitz by way of the Briendonk and Mechelen transit camps. Many died in Belgium as well. At the time of the German invasion, 140,000 Jews lived in the Netherlands. A Dutch civil administration continued to function under German supervision. By the spring of 1942, Dutch Jews were concentrated in Amsterdam or in the camps of Westerbork and Amersfoort. Deportations to the east began in July and they accelerated into October. Within 2 years, 110,000 Jews had been sent to death camps. Less than 25% of Dutch Jews survived the war. Of the 1,900 Norwegian Jews, about half of them lived in Oslo, the capital. The collaborationist government of Vidkun Quisling cooperated fully with the German occupiers. 800 Norwegian Jews were deported to Auschwitz, and the remainder escaped to Sweden with the help of the Norwegian underground. Norway became fully Judenrein, meaning cleansed of the Jews. This exhibit is called Escape to Switzerland, and in a moment you will see some identification tags. Those tags were worn by brother and sister Marcel and Vera Lechtman, pictured here, while they were staying in a children's home in Switzerland. The home was run by Margaret Locher, pictured here on the right, who arranged for the care of Jewish children who, like Marcel and Vera, had escaped deportation from internment camps in France. During the war, Marcel and Vera's father was interned at several camps and then ultimately sent to Auschwitz. Their mother, Tanya, sent them to a children's home in Limoges. There, the family became friends with Margaret Locher, a visitor in the home. In 1942, the Lechtmans were arrested. They were released and narrowly avoided deportation. The family went into hiding before fleeing to neutral Switzerland. They reunited with their friend Margaret, who had opened a home there. After the war's end, Marcel and Vera remained with Margaret while their mother carried out relief work. The Lechtmans returned to Tanya's native country of Poland in 1947. This photograph of a Berlin family was taken soon after a decree requiring German Jews to wear the Yellow Star of David badge in public, September 27, 1941. Manifestations of Nazi racial persecution were evident everywhere on the city streets of occupied Western Europe. This Parisian woman wears the Yellow Star of David badge required of French Jews in 1942. On the morning of February 12, 1941, the German occupying government surrounded the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam with a barbed wire fence. Eventually, most Amsterdam Jews were confined within it. Jews were banned from most public and private establishments, which often displayed Jews forbidden signs like this one here in Amsterdam. The Nazis' program to physically destroy the Jews of Europe evolved over time. Before 1940, Nazi policy focused on forced Jewish immigration from Germany. But this failed to provide a solution to the Jewish question, known as the Judengrage, a Nazi catchword used to justify the expulsion of the Jews, since few countries were willing to offer Jews a haven. As German troops overran countries in the East and West, more Jews fell under Nazi control. The possibility of havens within Europe vanished. After considering alternative plans for dealing with the Jews, Hitler and the Nazi leadership turned to a policy of genocide known as the final solution. The exact date of this decision, which originated with Hitler, may never be known. Mass shootings of Jews began in the newly conquered areas of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, soon after the start of the German invasion. Plans to send SS and police killing squads to these areas had been finalized in the spring before the invasion. The first methodical gassings of Jews began on December 8, 1941, at a death camp in Chełmno, a town in Poland. Preparations for these gassings had been underway for months. Throughout the conquered territories of Eastern Europe, the German authorities segregated Jews into ghettos, or restricted zones, where they were compelled to wear the Star of David badges. For each ghetto, the Germans selected a Jewish council to serve as the Jews' government and as an instrument of German control. The first ghetto was established in Poland on October 8, 1939. Others were soon set up in Warsaw, Lutz, and elsewhere in Poland. In the summer and autumn of 1941, ghettos were created in the German-occupied parts of the Soviet Union. By 1942, most of the Jews in Eastern Europe were confined in ghettos. Ghettos were originally instituted to concentrate Jews and separate them from the non-Jewish population. Later, they served as staging grounds for the extermination of Jews. The Germans gradually removed more than 2 million Jews from ghettos to concentration camps and death camps. First to be deported were the sick, the elderly, and the children. By the autumn of 1944, no ghettos remained. The establishment of ghettos brought chaos to entire communities and to thousands of Jews and non-Jewish households. With ties to the surrounding populations severed, most ghettoized Jews were abruptly deprived of their livelihoods. Both Jewish and non-Jewish families were evicted from their homes in order to create all-Jewish zones. In Poland, the Lutz ghetto was set up in a neighborhood that already housed 62,000 Jews. Another 100,000 moved in from other city districts. In Warsaw, entire neighborhoods were evacuated and gated to create the ghetto. A total of 113,000 Poles and 700 ethnic Germans living in the designated areas left their homes, and 138,000 Jews moved in. Bringing only what they could put in a wagon, Jews had to leave most of their possessions behind to be stolen or confiscated. They found themselves in unbearably crowded ghetto conditions with an average of 7 people per room. In Lutz, 2 non-Jewish streets crossed in the ghetto. Since Jews were not allowed in Polish parts of the city, they had to walk over these streets on wooden footbridges as non-Jewish streetcars passed below. This photo shows the footbridge over Zierska Street in 1941. On the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto, manifestations of segregation were everywhere, in Stars of David on the residents' armbands and on the ghetto streetcars. This photo is from 1940. Jews throughout German-controlled Europe recorded their experiences in diaries, letters, and artwork. In October of 1939, shortly after the occupation of Poland, Emanuel Ringelblum, a Jewish historian, laid the foundations for the Sabbath Delight Archive in Warsaw. He began collecting documents, recording testimonies, and writing commentaries on a daily basis. In May of 1940, Ringelblum's solo adventure became a secret group undertaking, eventually engaging several dozen people. The archive held German orders relating to the persecution of the Jew, public notices by the Jewish Council, scholarly studies of religious, economic, and cultural life in the Warsaw Ghetto, and bulletins from resistance groups and reports by Jews who witnessed shootings, deportations, or mass murders. Information about the killings was smuggled out to the Polish resistance in the hopes that the world would learn of the tragedy. In 1942 and 1943, the collected materials were buried in metal containers in the ghetto to preserve them for posterity. One of those who carried out this task was 19-year-old David Graeber, who wrote, "I would love to live to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and shriek to the world proclaiming the truth so that the world may know all. May the treasure fall into good hands. May it last into better times. May it alarm and alert the world to what happened and what was played out in the 20th century. We may now die in peace. We fulfilled our mission. May history attest for us." Ringelblum, Graeber, and many of their colleagues died at Nazi hands, never to know the post-war unearthing of their archives. Local German administrations referred to ghettos as Jewish residential quarters. They established two main types of ghettos, open and closed. A high brick wall separated closed ghettos, such as that of Warsaw, from the rest of the city, whereas only a fence surrounded many small ghettos. Most Jews were confined in closed ghettos. Ghetto walls minimized contact between Jews and non-Jews and helped the Germans control the ghetto's inhabitants. The Warsaw Ghetto Wall was 11 feet tall and topped by barbed wire. Most of the wall was destroyed during or after World War II. This here is a casting of the largest remaining segment at 55 Siena Street. Most of these work utensils were found after the war on the site of the former ghetto in Lutz, Poland. They include sewing machines, irons, and shoemaker's tools. The leaders of the Lutz and several other ghettos sought to protect the inhabitants from deportation by making their work indispensable to Germany. Many Lutz ghetto workers labored in textile and clothing factories that produced goods such as the Germans' military uniforms. Sanitary conditions in the ghettos were disastrous. Jewish authorities in the Lutz ghetto struggled to provide the inhabitants with adequate care, and there were only 1,550 hospital beds for a population of over 120,000 people. On September 1, 1942, the German police began a roundup of all the hospital patients in preparation for deporting them to the Kelmo Killing Center. Several patients tried to escape through the hospital windows, but almost all the patients were collected within 48 hours. This is the original main door of the chief hospital, the Wolf Hospital, located in the heart of the Lutz ghetto. The door frame is a casting of the original. In Poland, the Germans succeeded in obliterating a Jewish culture that had flourished there since the 13th century. This piece of a stained glass window is from a Krakow synagogue, perhaps the Temple Synagogue, built on Miodowa Street around 1860. Before the war, about 25,000 Jews lived in Tarnow, a city 45 miles east of Krakow in southern Poland. The German army occupied Tarnow on September 8th of 1939. From June 11th through 15th, 1942, SS troops killed between 5,000 and 10,000 Jewish residents, mostly children and the elderly. Many of them were taken into the Jewish cemetery and shot. This is the wrought iron gate of that cemetery. Theresienstadt was the only major Nazi ghetto for Jews that survived until the war ended in May of 1945. The Germans established the ghetto on November 24, 1941, in the Czech fortress town of Terezin to imprison Jews from Bohemia and Moravia. Under SS control, Theresienstadt served multiple functions: as an assembly center before transporting Jews to other ghettos, camps, or other killing centers, as a ghetto for elderly and prominent Jews from Germany and Austria, as a labor camp, and in 1944 as a propaganda vehicle to deceive the world about the Nazis' systemic murder of Europe's Jews. Approximately 155,000 Jews from the Czech lands, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, Hungary, and Slovakia were deported to Theresienstadt. Of these, 83,000 died in Nazi killing centers, other ghettos, or in labor camps. Another 35,000 perished in Theresienstadt itself from malnutrition, disease, and the harsh conditions. Some 15,000 children passed through Theresienstadt, almost all of them perished. In spite of the terrible living conditions and the constant threat of deportation, Theresienstadt had a highly developed cultural life. Artworks by Jewish artists included clandestine depictions of the ghetto's harsh reality. Those trapped in the ghetto made every effort to create some elements of a normal life, including arranging art classes for the children. The children's work capture memories of their lives before and also conditions while living in the ghetto. This is a small selection of the artwork that was recovered after the war. When children signed their artwork, researchers were able to learn their age during the war and also their fate. The majority of these children imprisoned at Theresienstadt were later sent to Auschwitz. While a small number of them survived, most were murdered in a gas chamber upon arrival at Auschwitz. Of the approximately 140,000 Jews transferred to Theresienstadt, Nearly 90,000 were deported to points further east and almost certain death. Roughly 33,000 died in Theresienstadt itself. Before the war, Warsaw was the center of Jewish life in Poland and contained the greatest concentration of Jews in Europe. Soon after the German conquest on September 29th of 1939, Warsaw's 375,000 Jews were required to wear white armbands with a blue Star of David. A Jewish council was appointed called a Judenrat. The German authorities closed Jewish schools, confiscated Jewish-owned property, and conscripted Jewish men into forced labor. In the autumn of 1940, a ghetto was established and Jews were required to move into it. On November 16th of that year, the Warsaw Ghetto was sealed. The Jewish Council sought to placate the Germans, who used the council to carry out their orders. It also tried to help the Jewish population, for whom daily life was a struggle against starvation and disease. Headed by Adam Chernyakov, the Warsaw Jewish Council developed an extensive bureaucracy in its efforts to meet the needs of 445,000 residents, including Jews from other parts of Europe and several hundred Roma gypsies. The first deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp began in July of 1942. By September 6th, the SS had deported about 250,000 Jews from Warsaw. Another wave of deportations began in January 1943. The third and final wave ended that spring on May 16th after the Germans defeated an armed revolt by the remaining ghetto Jews. The German officer in charge of the operation, SS General Jürgen Stroop, declared, "The Jewish quarter of Warsaw no longer exists." Each ghetto was governed by a Judenrat, whose chairman and members were usually appointed by the Germans. The councils struggled to provide food, shelter, heat, medicine, and work to a diverse, uprooted, and starving population. Eventually, the councils were ordered to help organize deportations of ghetto residents for what the Germans called resettlement in the East. The actual destinations were death camps. Under German command, Jewish police assisted in the roundups. The Jewish councils presided over doomed communities. Council chairmen faced terrible dilemmas. When asked to prepare lists of Jews for deportation, many, like Jacob Jens of Vilna, Moshe Marin of Sosnowiec, and Mordecai Rumskowski of Lodz, submitted to the Germans' demands. Other Jewish council leaders refused to do so. Dr. Joseph Parnes of the Lemberg ghetto was shot for insubordination. In some ghettos, council leaders cooperated with the underground Jewish resistance in trying to help Jews escape. The Germans seized Lutz, Poland's industrial center, on September 8, 1939, and later renamed it Litzmannstadt. In April 1940, the Lutz ghetto was sealed, trapping 164,000 Jews inside. With little food, medicine, or running water, the inhabitants lived among overcrowding, starvation, disease, and the stench of raw sewage. Conditions worsened with the arrival of Jews from Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, and Czechoslovakia. 5,000 Roma gypsies were also imprisoned in the ghetto. The ghettos were a source of inexpensive labor that was quickly exploited by the German businesses, the German army, and the SS. Hard labor came to dominate the lives of ghetto residents. The Germans, who controlled the food supply, allotted them starvation rations in return for the goods that they made. Several of the ghettos, located in large industrial cities, became suppliers for the German war effort. Lutz and Bialystok specialized in military clothing. Workers in the Minsk ghetto made attempts to sabotage the products they manufactured for the Germans. Some ghettos also had clandestine industries that made goods for trade with the outside world. Smugglers risked severe penalties to exchange these goods for desperately needed food. The Germans established a Jewish council headed by an orphanage director named Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski. Rumkowski controlled the ghetto's factories, hospitals, schools, and cultural life. Rumkowski hoped to save the Jews of Lutz by making them an indispensable workforce for the Germans. These hopes were doomed. Between January and May of 1942, 55,000 Jews and 5,000 Roma Gypsies were deported to the Chelmno death camp. That September, the Germans demanded that 25,000 elderly people and children under the age of 10 be resettled from the ghetto. Still hoping to save healthy adults, Rumkowski complied. The deportations stopped, but on June 23, 1944, they resumed. Almost all of the Jews remaining in the Lutz ghetto, including Rumkowski, were killed in death camps. Soon after German troops arrived on June 24, 1941, the Nazis established a ghetto in the Lithuanian city of Kaunas, known in Yiddish as Kovno. Before the war, 40,000 Jews lived in this community, whose renowned seminaries had produced generations of Jewish religious and intellectual leaders. Within a month of the German occupation, pogroms and massacres caused the death of 10,000 Kovno Jews. The ghetto was sealed in August 1941, confining nearly 30,000 inhabitants. Mass killings continued. On October 28, 10,000 Kovno Jews were taken to an execution site just outside the city and killed. Unlike the Jewish councils of Lutz and Warsaw, the Kovno ghetto leadership was elected by the Jews themselves. It aided all factions within the ghetto, including an underground resistance movement. The Jewish ghetto police in Kovno gave military training to young men and women, and the council helped them escape to the forests where they joined anti-Nazi partisans. Jews defied the Germans in other ghettos as well. The persistence of education, religious, cultural, and political activity within the ghettos itself constituted defiance. Inside the Warsaw Ghetto, underground groups collected information and published clandestine newspapers. In several ghettos, private homes served as houses of prayer after synagogues were closed down, and underground classes were held after Jewish schools were outlawed. In Lutz, Jewish medical students continued their training, and in Theresienstadt, Rabbi Leo Baek gave weekly lectures on theology. The Kovno Jews learned about the final solution in 1942 from an underground courier. From then on, the Jewish Council took a defiant stance towards German rule. The council commissioned artists to portray life in the ghetto. A photographer named Hirsch Kadushin secretly recorded ghetto scenes with a homemade camera. In the autumn of 1942, the Germans converted the Kovno ghetto into a concentration camp, and the following spring, mass killings resumed. In mid-1944, the ghetto was liquidated and its remaining residents were sent to concentration camps in Germany. Only 2,000 Kovno Jews survived the Holocaust. By the summer of 1942, hundreds of ghettos of varying sizes had been established throughout German-occupied Eastern Europe. More than 2 million Jews and over 8,000 Roma gypsies were confined in them. In all the ghettos, severe overcrowding, terrible sanitary conditions, and starvation were the norm. The earliest ghettos were set up in Poland in late 1939, before the beginning of the final solution. In the Soviet Union, most ghettos were established in the summer and autumn of 1941, soon after the first massacres of Jews had taken place. In Vilna, Lithuania, the Germans created 2 ghettos in early September of that year, after thousands of Jews had already been shot to death at Ponary, a mass extermination site in a wooded area outside the city. The largest ghettos included those of Warsaw, Lutz, Sosnowiec, and Białystok in Poland, Minsk in Belarusia, Kovno and Vilna in Lithuania, and Riga in Latvia. They were closed, meaning sealed off from the outside world with high walls and fences or barbed wire. Signed passes were required to enter or leave, and armed guards stood at entrances and exits. Smaller ghettos, such as those of Radom, Kelm, and Kielce, were usually surrounded only by a fence, and Jews could enter and leave them with relative ease. Most of these open ghettos were short-lived. Their inhabitants were either shot or deported to concentration camps or death camps. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, with over 100 infantry divisions and 3,550 tanks. 3 million German soldiers were reinforced by Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Slovak, and Croatian troops. Stalin had refused to believe warnings of an impending German attack, and the Soviet army was overwhelmed. Hundreds of thousands were killed or captured. Within weeks, German divisions conquered the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. In September, the Germans laid siege to Sevastopol and Leningrad, and by late October, the cities of Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkov had fallen. German troops reached within 16 miles of Moscow, but their rapid armored advance halted with the onset of winter in December. The Soviet army launched a counteroffensive, but the German onslaught resumed in the spring. By August 1942, German troops were close to Stalingrad and had advanced into the Caucasus. One motivation for the German invasion of the Soviet Union was the desire to acquire Lebensraum, living space, for the German people to colonize at the expense of the Russians, Ukrainians, and Baltic people. Hitler and other Nazi leaders thought of this goal both in racial and ideological terms. The conquest of living space meant not only German racial domination over the conquered people, but a crusade against Judaism and communism, in the Nazi view, 2 aspects of the same evil. In an address to his men, the SS chief Heinrich Himmler stated, "This invasion is an ideological battle and a struggle of races. Here in this struggle stands National Socialism, an ideology based on the value of our Germanic Nordic blood. On the other side stands a population of 180 million, a mixture of races whose very names are unpronounceable and whose physique is such that one can shoot them down without pity or compassion. These people have been welded by the Jews into one religion, one ideology, and that is called Bolshevism." As German troops invaded Soviet territory in the summer of 1941, they were accompanied by specially trained mobile squads that had been assigned to kill all Jews, Communist Party officials, and Roma gypsies in the conquered areas. These units entered towns, cities, and villages shortly after their occupation by the German army. The extermination operations followed a standard procedure. The unit's men rounded up the victims, drove them on foot or in trucks to a secluded site, made them remove their clothes, and shot them. Their corpses were buried in large pits which the victims themselves had often been forced to dig. Local Ukrainian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, and Belarusian collaborators and police volunteered their services to the killing squads and gave auxiliary support. In some places, the squads encouraged local pogroms. Waffen-SS, or Armed SS, and German police units also took an active part in the mass murders. The German army often cooperated as well. More than 1.2 million Jews were killed by these squads in the occupied Soviet territories. In the first 2 months of operations, the victims were mostly men, but beginning in August, the squads killed women and children as well. It was these mass shootings of Jews that officially initiated Hitler's final solution. A few days after the Germans captured Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, in September of 1941, Soviet saboteurs blew up several buildings occupied by the German authorities. The Nazis decided that in retaliation, the Jews of Kiev would be killed. On September 28, signs were posted in Kiev ordering all Jews in the city and its surroundings to appear the next morning, September 29th, at the Jewish cemetery. They were to be resettled, the posters stated. Failure to appear was punishable by death. Thousands of Jews came to the designated place the next morning. They were taken to Babin Yar, a ravine 2 miles from the city center, and were forced to hand over their valuables and remove their clothes. Groups were then herded into the ravine where members of a German killing unit shot them. More than 33,000 Jews were killed at Babin Yar in 2 days. During the following months, thousands more Jews, as well as partisans, Roma gypsies, and Soviet prisoners of war were executed there. Soviet reports after the war estimated the number of victims at 100,000. The true number may never be known. In August of 1943, as the Red Army advanced, the Nazis returned to Babin Yar to remove the evidence of mass murder. Bulldozers unearthed the thousands of corpses, which were then incinerated. Romania's pre-war Jewish population was one of the largest in Europe at about 750,000 people. In 1938, before its alliance with Nazi Germany, the fascist regime in Romania enacted anti-Jewish laws paralleling those of Germany. In 1940, Jews were expelled from professions and excluded from Romania's commercial life. A program similar to Germany's Aryanization provided for expropriation of Jewish property. In January of 1941, anti-Jewish riots took place in Bucharest for 3 days. Houses and shops in the Jewish section of the city were destroyed and 121 Jews were killed. On June 25th of that year, Romanian authorities staged a pogrom in the city of Iasi, in which more than 8,000 Jews were killed. On June 29th, 4,332 Jews were put on 2 trains, which were then sealed. After days of travel without food or water, 2,650 of them had died. During the following months, Romanian army units and Nazi mobile killing squads ranged through the regions of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, conducting massacres of Jews. That summer, Germany gave Romania a border region of the Ukraine called Transnistria, which included the port city of Odessa. On October 23rd, in reprisal for acts of sabotage, Romanian army units burned 19,000 Odessa Jews alive. Most of the Jews remaining in Bessarabia and northern Bukovina after the summer and autumn massacres were deported to camps and ghettos in Transnistria. Many died along the way, and 2/3 perished in Transnistria from epidemics, famine, and shootings. The Romanian government had agreed to the deportation of Romanian Jews living in Germany and France. But by the end of 1942, it was becoming evident that Germany would lose the war. Wanting to present a more positive image to the Allies, Ion Antonescu, the Romanian dictator, resisted Nazi pressures to deport most of the 292,000 Jews remaining in Romania to the Belzec extermination camp. The Nazi plan was never carried out. That winter, Romanian authorities negotiated with Jewish organizations abroad regarding the emigration to Palestine of those Romanian Jews who had survived in Transnistria. Because of the opposition of Adolf Eichmann and the Germans, this effort came to nothing. Germany occupied Hungary in 1944, including northern Transylvania, a part of Romania that had been transferred to Hungary. Between May 16th and June 27th, the Nazis deported the region's more than 131,000 Jews to Auschwitz. By the time Romania surrendered to the Allies, more than 350,000 Romanian Jews were dead. On January 20th, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office, convened a meeting of high-ranking Nazi officials at a villa in Wannsee, a lakeside suburb of Berlin. The collective task of those invited was to coordinate a final solution to the European Jewish question. The participants represented 14 government, SS, and Nazi Party institutions considered vital to the operation's success, among them the Interior, Justice, and Foreign Ministries, the Gestapo, the SS Race and Resettlement Main Office, and the Nazi Party and Reich Chancelleries. Also present was a representative of the general government, the civil administration of German-occupied Poland with jurisdiction over 2 million Jews. More than half of those present held doctoral degrees. Heydrich's specialist in Jewish matters, Adolf Eichmann, took minutes. In his overview of the current state of affairs relating to the Jews, Heydrich stated, "Another possible solution of the Jewish problem has now taken the place of immigration, evacuation of the Jews to the east. This operation should be regarded only as provisional, but it is already supplying practical experience of great significance in relation to the final coming solution of the Jewish problem." Most of the men assembled at Wannsee understood that evacuation to the east meant deportation to death camps and that the final solution meant methodical killing. By practical experience, Heydrich was referring to the fact that since June 1941, mobile killing squads had been shooting tens of thousands of Jews in the Soviet Union. Germans had been gassing Jews at the death camps of Kelmo in Poland since December 8, 6 weeks before the conference was held. Carbon monoxide gas chambers were under construction at the Belzec camp, and a farmhouse at Auschwitz-Birkenau was being converted into a gas chamber. An experiment in large-scale killing with Zyklon B, which is prussic acid gas, had been conducted at the same camp in early September. At his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, Adolf Eichmann reported, quote, "They spoke about methods of killing, about liquidation, about extermination," end quote. He further recalled that after the meeting ended, Heydrich sipped brandy and, quote, "We all sat together like comrades, not to talk shop, but to rest after long hours of work." Between July 22nd and mid-September 1942, at least 250,000 Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka death camp. For the 60,000 Jews remaining in the ghetto, deportation seemed inevitable. Zionist, Bundist, and communist youth groups in the ghetto formed the Jewish Fighting Organization known as the ZOB. Members of the Revisionist Party formed another resistance group called the Jewish Military Union known as the ZZW. In January 1942, when the Germans launched a second deportation, the ZOB's commander Mordecai Anilowitz called for armed resistance. He said not a single Jew should go to the railroad cars. Our slogan must be, "Let all be ready to die like human beings." After a few days, the deportation came to a halt. The Germans intended to begin deporting the remaining Jews on April 19, 1943, on the eve of Passover. When they entered the ghetto that morning, its streets were deserted, the inhabitants were all hiding in bunkers. On that day, the Jewish fighters rose in revolt. More than 2,000 heavily armed German soldiers and police were backed by tanks and artillery. The 700 to 750 ghetto fighters had a few dozen pistols and hand grenades. Yet in 3 days of street battles, the Germans were unable or unwilling to defeat the Jewish combatants. SS General Jürgen Stroop, the German commander, decided to force out the fighters by burning the ghetto down building by building. Resistance continued until the ghetto was completely destroyed. The Germans had planned to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto in 3 days, but the fighters held out for more than a month. The fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising understood its significance. On April 23, 1943, Mordecai Anilowitz, 24 years old, wrote to Yitzhak Zuckerman, his liaison with the Polish underground, quote, "The dream of my life has become true. Jewish self-defense at the Warsaw Ghetto has become a fact. Jewish armed resistance and revenge have become a reality. I have been a witness to the magnificent, heroic struggle of the Jewish fighters." The Polish underground was unprepared to aid the ghetto combatants who fought the Germans alone. The Nazi deportations of Jews and Roma gypsies took three main forms: transports from towns and cities to internment camps or ghettos, from smaller ghettos to larger ones, and, beginning in 1942, from camps and ghettos to 6 killing centers, all located in Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek, Chełmno, Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. Freight trains were the primary means of transportation. The Nazis camouflaged their intentions, referring to deportations as resettlement in the East and telling the victims that they were being transferred to labor camps where they would be treated well. Most Jews did not suspect the existence of the death camps and believed what the Nazis told them. Even as late as 1944, many Hungarian Jews had never even heard of Auschwitz. During the summer of 1942, about 250,000 Warsaw Jews were transported in freight cars to Treblinka, where they were killed with carbon monoxide gas. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, more than 437,000 Jews from Hungarian ghettos and death camps were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 147 trains. Most of them were gassed at Birkenau soon after their arrival. A direct quote from Primo Levi in Survival in Auschwitz, 1958. "We suffered from thirst and cold. At every stop, we clamored for water or even a handful of snow, but we were rarely heard. The soldiers of the escort drove off anybody who tried to approach the convoy. 2 young mothers, nursing their children, groaned night and day begging for water. The hours of darkness were nightmares without end. Next to me, crushed against me for the whole journey, there had been a woman. We had known each other for many years, and the misfortune had struck us together, but we had known very little of each other. Now, in the hour of decision, we said things to each other that are never said among the living. Everybody said farewell to life through his neighbor." This is a ghetto hand cart. In Theresienstadt, this cart and others like it were used to transport heavy loads. Special workers also used them to carry bodies of ghetto residents who had died of starvation and disease. This is a Warsaw manhole cover from the war period from the Mila Street neighborhood in the ghetto. Some of the Jewish figures escaped the ghetto through the foul Warsaw sewer system. Tuvia Borzakowski, a ghetto survivor, later said, "It was May 10, 1943, at about 10 o'clock in the morning. We saw the manhole cover removed and light flooded the sewer. We had spent 30 hours there. The bright light dazzled our eyes, which had become accustomed to perpetual night. The street was full of people. They stopped and looked with curiosity at the strange-looking individuals climbing out of a sewer. We were some sight, lumps of filth with emaciated faces out of which stared dead eyes." This workbench concealed the entrance to a hiding place for Polish Jews in the house of Stephen Petrie in Walwer, a Warsaw suburb. For 2 years, Petrie hid the Sapiro family in his basement. When German police came to search the house, the Shapiros hid in a small crawl space under the basement. They entered it through a trapdoor beneath this workbench. Most deported Jews endured a torturous train journey to death camps in bare freight cars under conditions of hunger and thirst, extreme overcrowding, and horrible sanitation. In winter, they were exposed to freezing temperatures, and in summer, they were enveloped in suffocating heat and stench. Many of those deported, especially the elderly people and young children, died during the journey. This walkway passes through a Karlsruhe freight car, one of several types that were used to deport Jews. As many as 100 victims were packed into one single car. Deportation trains usually carried between 1,000 and 2,000 persons, and sometimes as many as 5,000. Their weight slowed the speed of travel to about 30 miles an hour, greatly prolonging the ordeal. Frequently, the trains halted for hours or days at a time on side tracks or in stations along the way. This German freight car is standing on tracks that led to the Treblinka station. This group of Jews from Krakow was deported in a freight car of the Karlsruhe type in 1941 through 1942. At the 6 death camps where Jews were exterminated, the SS, in a procedure called the selection, condemned arriving prisoners to one of two fates: immediate death or extermination through work. In the death camps of Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, all but a handful of deportees were gassed shortly after arrival. A small number of Jews were spared temporarily for work at the camps, which included the task of burning or burying the bodies of gassed victims. These workers, too, were put to death after a few weeks or months to be replaced by new arrivals. Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek operated both as an extermination camp and as slave labor camps. While genocide remained their primary purpose, the minority of Jews spared for labor was larger. On the arrival platform, an SS officer conducted the selection. The sick, the elderly, pregnant women, and young children were sent to the gas chambers. Male and female prisoners deemed capable of work were sent in another direction for assignment to slave labor. An escapee from Auschwitz, Rudolf Verbe, said, "There was a place called the Ramp where the trains with the Jews were coming in. They were coming in night and day, sometimes 1 per day and sometimes 5 per day, from all sorts of places in the world. I worked there from August 18, 1942 until June 7, 1943. I saw those transports rolling one after another, and I have seen at least 200 of them. I have seen it so many times that it became a routine. Constantly, people from the heart of Europe were disappearing, and they were arriving to the same place with the same ignorance of the fate of the previous transport. I knew that within a couple of hours after they arrived there, 90% of them would be gassed." Between June 1941 and May 1945, More than 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German custody. Most perished during the first 12 months from starvation, disease, and exposure, although many tens of thousands were shot as communists, Jews, or Asiatics. In mid-1942, the death rate slowed down as the prisoners of war became essential to the Nazi war economy. By 1943, more than 500,000 were working as slave laborers in German industry and agriculture. The Nazis defined Roma gypsies as racially inferior, and their fate closely paralleled that of the Jews. In most countries of occupied Europe, Roma were interned and deported to death camps. 5,000 Austrian Roma were sent to the Lodz ghetto and from there were deported to Chełmno. In the Soviet Union, Poland, and the Balkan countries, units of the SS police and the German army killed as many as 200,000 Roma gypsies. Thousands more were imprisoned in concentration camps. 23,000 Roma were taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau. A separate camp was set up for them in which the conditions were exceptionally bad. Almost all the Roma in Auschwitz were gassed, worked to death, or fell victim to epidemics. Many, including children, died after being subjected to inhumane medical experiments. On August 2, 1944, the Gypsy family camp was liquidated and all the remaining Romani men, women, and children were killed in gas chambers. The Nazis also criminalized same-sex relationships. About 10,000 homosexuals, most of them German and Austrian, were imprisoned in the camps. They often received the hardest work assignments, as a result of which more than half of them did not survive. Many were also sentenced and interned under other prisoner categories. Political prisoners and Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned in the concentration camps, but they were not subjected to systemic killing. Nevertheless, large numbers of political prisoners died in the camps, as did more than 1/3 of the Jehovah's Witnesses. This map, drawn shortly after the war ended in 1945, shows the locations of Gestapo prisons, death camps, and concentration camps with their satellite camps. During the war, the number of Nazi camps expanded into the thousands, and at its peak, the camp system contained over 700,000 prisoners. The Nazis and their collaborators sought to deceive Jews and others who were deported to concentration camps and killing centers. They portrayed the deportations as resettlements and permitted people to bring a few belongings to set up home in a new place. Upon their arrival at the camps, Jews and other victims were stripped of all their personal items. These included clothes, shoes, hairbrushes, prosthetic limbs, eyeglasses, toys, books, and kitchen utensils. Camp officials forced prisoners to sort through the stolen property and ship selected items to Germany to benefit their economy. This arch is a casting made from the entrance gate to the Auschwitz concentration camp that reads, "Work will make you free." It was a cynical falsehood suggesting that the purpose of concentration camps was to reform inmates who could earn their freedom through work. In reality, the aim of the camps was to extract the maximum amount of work from the prisoners, whatever the cost to health or life, and to kill all the Jewish inmates through overwork, starvation, or gassing. This group of Jewish men, women, and children from Hungary was photographed a short distance from the gas chambers at the Auschwitz killing center. Unaware of their fate, they were sent to their deaths soon after this photo was taken in 1944. A path connecting the Treblinka killing center with a nearby forced labor camp was paved with the crushed remains of tombstones from Jewish cemeteries. Below is a casting from a section of that path. Hebrew letters are visible on several pieces.
Until I started to realize that we are condemned to die, and all Jews are condemned to die. For some time, you believe the Germans are creating just kill people en masse, but that everybody should be killed, that we didn't understand it.
We then were asked to investigate things. I had some photographs of my family which were torn to shreds.
Then we were addressed, we were ordered, everybody was ordered to stand up on a stool, and they shake us. They shake our hair and the private parts. We couldn't even recognize each other into those showers. And they first opened the hot water. So we were scalded, and as we ran out from under the hot water, we were beaten back by the SS and by the capos to go under the showers again. So they opened the ice cold water, which had the same effect. And finally, we were out of this shower. Each of us was given one garment. He didn't receive not even underwear or braziers or panties, just that one dress.
It was as if it was set up, that a tall woman would get a real short dress and a little woman would get a long dress. And they weren't willing to switch because obviously it was more favorable to have a longer dress because it was more protected.
My mind was, I don't want to know that. If I ever knew that, I'm not going to be able to get out of here. I told him. So I didn't want to get out of that. Only thing this flight says to me signaling, if you don't have a number, you're not going to be able to go into work. They catch you without a number, you'll be in trouble. You know, this and that. And I told him, I said, what's going on here? He said, the chimney's there. You're lined up over there. I said, what are you talking about? You're crazy. He said, yeah, you're lined up over there. You know, this is the crematorium, the third people. I said, you must be nuts. I don't know you. I didn't believe it. You smell the sweetness in nighttime. You see the chimney, the fire come out from the chimney, and I could not believe that something like this happened.
They told me to see
This is like,
Sleeping after.
this is late.
they will kill me. Just for the simple reason that someone did it in their pants. They sold their pants, sold their uniforms. So, poor guy couldn't hold it. Dysentery was something very, very common. And 2 weeks of Auschwitz, your eyes would fall in water, the whole face would be blown up with water. Your legs would fall because of malnutrition and malnutrition. And then it became a skeleton, which was called communism.
And of course, the dead people that would die in the night from starvation or disease, or from killing, from beatings, they too will need to be carried out from the barracks every single morning and lined up in front of the barracks. They too will need to be counted. Every single body needed to be accounted for. They will not get any food until every single person was accounted for.
Nazi Germany set up some 20,000 camps to imprison millions of victims from all over Europe. At many of these sites, prisoners were housed in uninsulated wooden barracks that quickly became overcrowded. In late 1941, the SS ordered more than 250 prefabricated wooden barracks to be shipped to the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. These structures, originally designed to house horses, could be erected by forced inmate labor in less than 1 day. This restored barracks building came from the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp complex. Each wooden barrack at Auschwitz-Birkenau contained 3-tier bunks. At times, 5 or 6 prisoners slept on each level of a bunk, making it possible to lodge more than 400 inmates in a single barrack. Prisoners generally received only a light blanket and sometimes a thin straw mattress. The Nazi regime began using carbon monoxide gas for mass killings in 1940 to murder hospital patients with disabilities. Employing some of the personnel and the expertise gained from the euthanasia program, the SS expanded the use of carbon monoxide to most of the killing centers in occupied Poland. In the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek, the SS used the commercial pesticide Zyklon B to kill human beings. The highly poisonous hydrogen cyanide caused its victims to die by asphyxiation. These are inert pellets of Zyklon B that were found at the Majdanek concentration camp and canisters for the pesticide. This is a casting of the gas chamber door at the Majdanek concentration camp. Once the victims were forced inside, the door was barred on the outside, and the SS guards could view the killings through the small peephole. In summer 1941, Nazi Germany began the systematic mass murder of Europe's Jews. Starting in the occupied Soviet Union, mobile SS detachments, German order police battalions, and collaborationist units rounded up and killed about 1 million Jews in 6 months. Most were shot outside the towns, villages, and cities where they had lived. While death by firing squads continued in Soviet territory, the SS devised a new method of mass murder, the killing center. In late 1941 and 1942, the Nazis established killing centers in German-occupied Poland to eradicate Europe's remaining Jews in mobile gas vans at Chełmno and in large gas chambers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Virtually all the prisoners transported to these 4 camps were immediately murdered. Auschwitz-Birkenau functioned as both a concentration camp and a killing center. Majdanek served primarily as a concentration camp and secondarily as a killing site. Both had gas chambers. Nearly 2.7 million Jews died in the killing centers. Tens of thousands of Poles, Roma and Sinti gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, and others were also killed at these sites. The SS exploited concentration camp prisoners not only as forced labor, but as involuntary subjects of medical experiments. Thousands of inmates were used to test the effectiveness of pharmaceutical drugs, surgical procedures, and other treatment methods. Some of the research was driven by German military needs, such as high altitude, malaria, and freezing experiments, or bone and muscle transplantations. Other projects were designed to advance Nazi racial and ideological goals, such as attempts at mass sterilization by radiation or surgery, the collection of skeletal and organ specimens from the murdered prisoners, and glandular implants given to male homosexuals. Many inmates died or were left mutilated and traumatized as a result of these experiments. This is Maria Kuzmierzuk, a Polish prisoner at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The damage to her leg was caused by SS medical experiments using antibiotic drugs. The wound never healed, and she remained permanently crippled. From 1933 to 1945, Nazi Germany transported millions of people to concentration camps and killing centers. Only a few victims escaped death in the killing centers. Those who were sent to other installations stood a better chance of survival, but many died from disease, ill treatment, starvation, medical experiments, and executions. Survival depended on factors such as the prisoner category to which one belonged, the level of solidarity or mutual aid among the inmates, physical and health conditions at the site, and luck. Despite SS efforts to dehumanize the inmates, many prisoners tried to maintain some semblance of their humanity. By 1942, manpower shortages and military losses had led the Nazis to expand the use of forced labor and expedite production on an ambitious ballistic missile project called the V-2, or Vengeance Weapon 2. Prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp in Germany worked on the project using these tools to build the V-2 rockets. Conditions for the prisoners were brutal. After British forces bombed Germany's rocket facility in 1943, the Nazis moved production to filthy underground tunnels. Laborers worked grueling 12-hour shifts, enduring starvation, disease, and violence from guards and capos. Before barracks were built, prisoners were forced to live in the tunnels, and some did not see daylight for months. Approximately 20,000 prisoners died at Dora Mittelbau. The V-2 missile project was one of many Nazi efforts to exploit prisoners and work them literally to death. When the Nazis established the concentration camp system, they used the camps to punish enemies of the regime with hard labor. As the camp system developed, labor became a form of genocide known as extermination through work. Prisoners, especially Jews and others whom the Nazis viewed as racially inferior, were housed, fed, and worked in such a way that death often followed within a few weeks. Beginning in 1942, the SS established hundreds of satellite camps near war industry factories. Inmates of these camps were exploited as a source of industrial slave labor. The prisoners were regarded not as persons, but as raw material to be used and discarded. Because of brutal working conditions, deficient food rations, abysmal sanitary facilities, and exposure to severe weather, they soon exhausted their reserves of strength. When they were too weak and ill to continue working, they were put to death. As the war continued, the labor of concentration camp inmates and of conscripted non-German civilians grew more essential to the economy. Beginning in the spring of 1942, labor shortages compelled the SS to modify its treatment of some of these workers. Soviet prisoners of war were no longer starved, shot, or gassed, but instead were put to work. The new policy, however, did not affect the ongoing genocide of Jews and Roma gypsies. Major German businesses cooperated with the SS in setting up large-scale slave labor enterprises. Among the companies that eagerly sought slave labor were the chemical conglomerate IG Farben, the automobile engine producers BMW and Daimler-Benz, the aircraft manufacturer Messerschmitt, and the Krupp Steelworks. The Nazi government also brought to Germany civilian workers from most of the conquered countries, especially Poland and the occupied parts of the Soviet Union. In September 1944, more than 5 million conscript laborers, almost one-fifth of Germany's total workforce, were laboring in Nazi Germany, most of them against their will. At the Mauthausen camp in Austria, prisoners hauled heavy stones up the 186 steps of the staircase of death, unloaded them, and then repeated this task endlessly. A survivor later recalled, "It was a common saying in Mauthausen that each rock cost the life of a man." SS guards often pushed exhausted prisoners off the staircase to their death. This prisoner was killed that way. These stones are from the Mauthausen quarry. Here are more inmates in the punishment brigade at Mauthausen hauling stones up and down the staircase of death. And here is a model of an Auschwitz gas chamber and crematorium. There were 4 gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau by 1942, and they represent Nazi mass murder in its most industrialized form. Each of the 4 facilities could kill and incinerate an average 1,000 victims per day. About 1 million Jews and thousands of non-Jewish victims were killed in the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau. After arriving at the camp by rail, those selected for immediate death were marched to the underground entrance of the gas chamber. Victims entered the complex down a stairway leading to the underground undressing room, which could hold about 1,000 people. There, SS guards and specially assigned inmates demanded they surrender their valuables and to undress for a delousing shower. When the victims had taken off all their clothes, they were herded into the underground gas chamber, disguised with fake shower heads as a shower room. As soon as the chamber was filled with people, sealed and locked, SS guards poured Zyklon B pellets in through special vents in the roof, and the deadly gas was released. Most of the victims died within a few minutes. After about 20 minutes, when all were dead, ventilators expelled the poisonous air. Under SS Guard, a special detachment of prisoners hauled the corpses into an adjacent room where gold teeth and fillings were removed and hair was cut off the women's heads. In some killing centers, hair was shorn off prior to gassing. A freight elevator then lifted the corpses to an incinerating room on the ground floor. The bodies were put into the crematorium's 15 ovens, 3 or 4 people to an oven. On some occasions, corpses were burned in pits to keep up with the rate of killing. Smaller groups of victims were sometimes shot instead of being gassed. The shootings took place at a site just outside the Crematorium 2 building. Frequently arriving deportees who were unable to walk were separated from larger groups of victims and shot at these sites. Rudolf Hess, SS commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, stated in his post-war memoirs, "From time to time, women would suddenly give the most terrible shrieks while undressing, or tear their hair, or scream like maniacs. These were immediately led away behind the building and shot in the back of the neck with a small caliber weapon." A day in a Nazi concentration camp consisted of a series of deprivations and torments. As early as 4 o'clock in the morning, prisoners were awakened for the roll call, during which they had to stand at attention to be counted, often for hours. One lengthy roll call at Auschwitz left 120 prisoners dead or in a coma. At 6 o'clock, prisoners were marched to work. With only short breaks, they remained at grueling slave labor for 11 hours. Curfew fell at around 9 o'clock at night after the evening roll call. Prisoners slept on overcrowded and lice-ridden wooden bunks. The prisoners' food was scarcely edible and lacked enough calories to support life. Prisoners wore ragged, filthy clothing. Hygienic conditions were appalling, resulting in epidemics that caused great numbers of deaths. During a typhoid epidemic at Dachau in the winter of 1942-43, the death rate was about 25%. At the workplace, foremen called capos, recruited from among prisoners in the camp, forced fellow inmates to labor at a punishing pace. SS men and capos used whips, sticks, and fists on those unable to keep up. In every major camp, Gestapo officers employed torture and collective punishments to maintain tight control. Prisoners were routinely beaten severely for minor infractions of rules, More serious offenses were punished by public floggings, frequently resulting in death, or by public hangings. Disobedient prisoners were often shot to death on the pretext of attempting to escape. This is Czech businessman Oskar Schindler, who had seen working with the Nazis and using prisoners as cheap labor as an opportunity. But as the war progressed, Schindler used his position to protect prisoners from being deported to killing centers. He arranged for hundreds of Jews to instead be relocated to work in his Brunlitz concentration camp ammunitions factory. With Schindler's protection, they survived the war. Conditions were still difficult for those at Brunlitz. However, the people there had easier and safer working conditions compared with other camps. They were also allowed to make and keep items for personal use. The SS sought to dehumanize the prisoners as soon as they arrived. New camp inmates were forced to strip off their civilian clothing, have their heads shaved, and be deloused. They were then given uniforms and prisoner numbers. This photo is from Buchenwald. SS guards frequently carried out collective reprisals against the prisoner population for the infractions of a single individual. Beatings, punitive exercises, and executions were commonplace. These 20 Buchenwald prisoners were hanged for the killing of a single German policeman. In 1944, Allied pilots flew a series of reconnaissance missions over the Auschwitz complex in search of industrial sites. In doing so, they also photographed Auschwitz-Birkenau. Since the primary U.S. bombing target was the IG Farben synthetic oil and rubber works near Auschwitz III, Allied intelligence officers did not analyze these photographs showing either Auschwitz I or II. In the late 1970s, using more advanced technology, U.S. government photo interpreters re-examined this film for images of Auschwitz-Birkenau. This photograph shows Auschwitz I, II, Birkenau, and III, Monowitz. Next to Monowitz is the IG Farben factory complex, which U.S. bombers struck on August 20th and September 13th, 1944. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, a total of 437,492 Jews were deported from Hungary. Most were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. On some days, as many as 10,000 people were killed in its gas chambers. In desperation, Jewish organizations made various proposals to halt the extermination process and rescue Europe's remaining Jews. A few Jewish leaders called for the bombing of the Auschwitz gas chambers. Others opposed it. Like some Allied officials, both sides feared the death toll or the German propaganda that might exploit any bombing of the camp's prisoners. No one was certain of the results. Yet within a week, the U.S. Army Air Force carried out a heavy bombing of the IG Farben synthetic oil and rubber works near Auschwitz III, less than 5 miles from Auschwitz-Birkenau. The gas chambers remained untouched. In the summer and fall of 1944, the World Jewish Congress and the U.S. government's War Refugee Board forwarded requests to bomb Auschwitz to the U.S. War Department. These requests were denied. On August 14th, John J. McCloy, Assistant Secretary of War, advised the World Jewish Conference that such an operation could be executed only by the diversion of considerable air support now engaged in decisive operations elsewhere and would in any case be of such doubtful efficacy that it would not warrant the use of our resources. Proponents of the bombing continue to argue that such an action, while it might have killed prisoners, could have hampered the killing operations and perhaps ultimately saved lives. At the very least, they believe, it might have demonstrated Allied concern for the fate of the Jews. For the prisoners at Auschwitz, the bombs dropping nearby gave hope. One survivor recalled, "We were no longer afraid of death, at any rate, not of that death. Every bomb that exploded filled us with joy and gave us new confidence in life." By 1944, U.S. officials had been informed of the killing operations at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Well before the deportations from Hungary, the War Department had essentially ruled out using military personnel in rescue missions. It was argued that the most effective relief for Nazi victims was a swift end to the war. In August, McCloy added that bombing might provoke even more vindictive action by the Germans. The final solution involved wholesale theft as well as mass killings, and it generated thousands of freight car loads full of stolen goods. Before Jews were gassed at Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, the SS confiscated all their belongings. Money and other valuables were sent to the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. Among the mountains of clothing and footwear that accumulated, Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek yielded hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes, the best of which were distributed to German settlers in Poland. Tattooing was a part of the dehumanizing registration process in the Auschwitz concentration camp system. In the fall of 1941, SS authorities stamped incoming Soviet prisoners of war with an identification number on the left side of their chest, using a metal tool with a long needle and interchangeable numerals. Later, prisoners selected for forced labor or medical experiments had serial numbers tattooed on their left forearm with a single needle. Generally, only Jewish and Roma and Sentai Gypsy inmates and Soviet prisoners of war were tattooed. German, Polish, Czech, and Soviet civilian detainees were largely exempt from this practice. The vast majority of Jews deported to Auschwitz were never registered or tattooed, but were murdered in the gas chambers. These photographs show the still visible identification tattoos on surviving former Auschwitz prisoners. 4 Greek Jewish survivors in the center were photographed in 1990, while the others were taken in 1991 in Los Angeles. Many Soviet prisoners of war had numbers tattooed on their chests instead of their forearms. This is one of the few pre-liberation photographs showing such tattoos. It was taken on September 21, 1944, the day when these prisoners were transferred to the Mauthausen camp. They were killed there on September 25th and 26th. All of the 131,000 women selected for slave labor at Auschwitz had their hair shorn on arrival, among them a group of Hungarian Jewish women. Men were shorn as well. In some killing centers, victims' hair was cut prior to gassing, in others afterwards. The State Museum of Auschwitz in Poland exhibits hair from about 40,000 deportees. The hair in this photograph represents only a minuscule fraction of the total amount shorn from concentration camp prisoners and genocide victims. The hair shorn from arrivals at Nazi camps and killing centers was sold very cheaply to private firms, which used it to make felt slippers, bumpers for boats, and stuffing for mattresses. At liberation, Soviet troops found over 15,000 pounds of human hair at Auschwitz, in bales averaging 40 pounds each. In addition to appropriating the valuables, clothing, and hair of gassed victims, the SS also claimed their gold teeth, crowns, and fillings. These were later melted down and sent to the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. In the crematorium building at Majdanek, a squad of prisoners had to remove the gold from corpses. A special table was used for this purpose. Blood drained through a central hole. This is a casting of one of those tables. At other camps, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, gold teeth and fillings were pulled from corpses as they lay on the ground. The unprecedented scale of Nazi mass murder resulted in vast numbers of corpses that had to be disposed of. Initially, the SS forced the victims to dig their own graves at the killing fields. Inside the camps, bodies were dumped in pits. At some of the killing centers and concentration camps, the SS constructed special crematoria to reduce the bodies to ashes. As early as 1942, the SS ordered the systemic exhumation and incineration of hundreds of thousands of bodies buried in mass graves to remove traces of the crime. After the SS had completed the physical destruction of their murdered victims' bodies, they sought to eliminate traces of the killing installations. In 1943, the Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, and Chelmno camps were razed to the ground after the killing operations there ended. In 1944-45, the SS blew up the Birkenau crematoria after dismantling the gassing equipment. These concrete fragments composed part of a Chelmno crematorium, which was blown up by the SS on April 7, 1943, when the camp was destroyed, as seen in the photo. The rubble was discovered in 1986, along with personal objects belonging to the victims. In the rear are castings of Mauthausen's crematorium ovens, a stretcher that moved the corpses into the ovens, and a crematorium poker. The photograph was taken clandestinely in August 1944 when Crematorium 5 at Auschwitz-Birkenau broke down under the strain of burning thousands of bodies, and corpses had to be burned in open pits. We started to talk about this beautiful wall of photographs and the 4 photographers who took them in last week's video called The Nazi Assault 1933 to 1939. These photos were taken between the years 1890 and 1941 in the town of Aishishak, located in Lithuania, which was a typical Jewish community of Eastern Europe. The final solution began in Aishishak soon after German troops arrived there on June 23, 1941. A Jewish council was formed. The Jews' valuables were collected and confiscated. Jewish men and women were abused and humiliated. On September 21st, on the eve of the Jewish New Year, an SS mobile killing squad entered the town accompanied by Lithuanian volunteers. 4,000 Jews were herded into 3 synagogues and imprisoned there. 3 days later, on September 24th, the Jews were taken from the synagogues to a horse market on the outskirts of town. The next day, the men were led in groups of 250 from the marketplace to the old Jewish cemetery. There, the SS men ordered them to undress and to stand at the edge of open pits, where they were shot by Lithuanian guards. On September 26th, the women and children were shot near the Christian cemetery. 2 of these photographers, Alte Katz and Ben Zion Schrader, were among the victims. 900 years of Jewish life and culture in Aishishak came to an end in 2 days. Today, no Jews live in Aishishak. It may seem strange to offer a postcard after a video as intense as this one. I wasn't planning to include postcards in this series. However, after viewing the exhibits at this museum today, I felt the need to visit the gift shop and make a donation. And while I was there, I decided to make some purchases as well to help support the museum. I feel like this is one of the most important museums in Washington, D.C. Since I don't need as many postcards as I bought in the pack, I will send this one out to the first person who asks for it in the comments section. If you are the first, I will respond with an email. You can send me an address to, and I'll write you a note and put it out with the next mail. Alright everyone, that concludes my video on the Final Solution exhibit at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. If you are still here, I appreciate that you have watched and learned along with me. This was a heavy one, unlike most of the videos that I share here on this channel, but the Holocaust has always been very dear and important to me. The Final Solution exhibit left me face to face with the machinery of genocide. Planned, systematic, brutally efficient, and utterly incomprehensible to me. This was not the work of chaos or impulse. It was the result of deliberate policies, bureaucratic orders, and countless individuals choosing to participate, comply, or look away. The Final Solution was a process that began with words, with laws, with isolation, and ended in unbelievable, unimaginable horror. This exhibit asks us to remember the millions of lives lost and also inspires me to reflect on the warning signs that made such a horror possible. May we all carry this memory forward not only as history, but as a call to conscience so that never again becomes more than a catchphrase, but instead a motto that we take to heart. As always, I'd like to share some beautiful plants and flowers from my walk home to help us return to a better frame of mind. And I'll see you another day in another adventure.